Autumn evenings were a comfort to me, crisp air seeping through the cracks of old windows. Over the years, I had found solace in the predictable stillness of my home alone. I had crafted a routine that kept me steady. Books filled the shelves, and my tea ritual became a source of calm. The silence was rarely intrusive, more of a reminder of how far life had taken me from the bustling chaos that once filled these walls. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when the house brimmed with life and noise, laughter, music, the clatter of dishes in the sink, and then there were the arguments. My marriage had been like a steady hum that gradually grew into a discordant roar. Love turned to tension, tension to cold civility. Eventually, it crumbled under its own weight. The divorce had left scars, but it also brought a strange sort of relief. After the split, I focused on being the best mother I could be for Mike. He was 13 at the time, old enough to understand, but not old enough to process it all. I saw the pain in his eyes, the confusion. He tried to hide behind his teenage bravado. I worried endlessly about the kind of man he would grow into, whether the fractures in our family would harden into fractures in his heart. But as he grew older, he seemed to find his way. College took him far from home, and life carried him even farther. Years passed, and my connection with him became sporadic. A phone call here, a holiday visit there. The silence of the house filled the space, as he once occupied, and eventually it became my companion. I told myself that it was enough, that he was out living his life, and that was what mattered that night. However, the quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door. It startled me at first. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart picked up a nervous rhythm as I made my way to the door, pulling my cardigan tighter around me. When I opened it, I was met with a sight that took my breath away. Mike stood there, framed by the soft glow of the porch light. He looked older, his features sharper and more defined than I remembered. His broad shoulders seemed weighed down by something invisible, and his eyes, once so full of life, now carried a heaviness that made my chest ache. Seeing him there was like a jolt to my system, a mix of joy and concern. He carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, its worn edges speaking of travels I hadn't been a part of. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of him stirring memories I thought I had long tucked away. He looked around the room, taking in the small changes I had made over the years, the rearranged furniture, the new plants I had added to make the space feel as empty. His expression was unreadable, but I sensed a deep sadness beneath the surface. Without thinking, I reached for him, pulling him into an embrace. The warmth of his body against mine was grounding, a reminder of a connection that time and distance couldn't erase. I held him tightly, as if to make up for all the moments I hadn't been there for. And then it happened. Something I wasn't prepared for. As we pulled apart, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't the kind of kiss I was expecting, not a quick motherly peck on the cheek or forehead. His lips brushed mine softly, lingering just long enough to leave me frozen in place. I didn't know what to make of it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the moment. It had been so long since I'd felt anything like this, a tenderness that it caught me completely off guard. He stepped back quickly, his expression shifting to something I couldn't quite read. I felt a strange mix of emotions: confusion, shock, and something else I wasn't ready to name. The kiss lingered in my mind like a whisper, quiet but insistent. I turned away, focusing on the small tasks that suddenly seemed urgent. My hands trembled slightly as I busied myself with anything to ground myself. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind, the way his eyes had held mine just before that night. As I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of his return settling over me. There was so much I didn't know: why he had come back, what had brought him to my doorstep after all these years. And yet I couldn't ignore the feeling that his arrival was the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. By the time the evening settled fully around the house, the warmth of the fire became the only light in the room. The soft flickering glow danced across the walls, casting long shadows that moved like whispers. I sat on the worn couch, my feet tucked beneath me, while Mike lingered in the chair nearby, his posture relaxed, but his expression distant. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt like the weight of everything he wanted to say was pressing down on the air. I didn't push him to speak. I knew better than that. It had taken years of motherhood, years of knowing him to understand that patience was key. Mike had always been the type to carry his burden silently until they threatened to crush him. Eventually, his words began to spill out, slowly at first, like water dripping from a faucet that hadn't been turned on in a long time. He spoke of his marriage, of how it had started with so much promise. They had met when he was younger, more optimistic, convinced that love was enough to weather anything. She was vibrant and ambitious, drawing him in with her energy and charm. He thought they would build a life together, a partnership rooted in mutual respect and understanding. But the reality was different. He described how the cracks began to show early on, small disagreements that grew into full-blown fights. She wanted more than he could give, demanding pieces of him that he didn't know how to offer. He tried to change for her, bending himself into someone he thought she wanted, but it was never enough. His voice grew quieter as he explained how things ended, how the final months of their marriage were filled with cold silences and emotional distance. She had left him, taking more than just their shared belongings. She had taken his sense of self, his confidence, and the belief that he was enough. The divorce wasn't just a legal split, it was the dismantling of the life he thought he was building. As he spoke, I felt a deep ache in my chest. It wasn't just sympathy for what he had been through, it was something more personal. His words stirred memories I had buried long ago, memories of my own failed marriage. I hadn't thought about his father in years. Not really. The love we once had felt like a distant echo, something I could barely remember through the haze of everything that came after. I had believed in us once, too, believed we could weather the storms that life threw our way. But like Mike, I learned the hard way that love wasn't always enough. Our marriage had been marked by a slow unraveling, the kind that doesn't happen all at once, but over time, like a rope frame. With every pull, the arguments, the misunderstandings, the growing distance, it all added up until there was nothing left to hold on to. I told Mike about those years, about the loneliness I felt, even when I wasn't alone, and the bittersweet relief that came when it finally ended. Divorce had left me with my own kind of emptiness, when I had spent years trying to fill with work hobbies and the quiet routines of daily life. As I shared my story, I saw the way he looked at me, not just as his mother, but as someone who truly understood. We were in that moment two people bound not just by blood, but by the shared experience of heartbreak. And whilst the room felt smaller, somehow the firelight casting a soft glow that seemed to draw us closer. Mike shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together. There was something in his posture, in the way he looked at me that felt different. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way his eyes lingered on me longer than they had before. For it wasn't just a look of gratitude or affection, it was something deeper. Something I couldn't quite name. It stirred a mix of emotions in me, some familiar, others unsettling. When he moved closer, it was slow and deliberate, as if he were testing the waters. He sat beside me on the couch, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth of him next to me. His hand brushed mine, a soft, fleeting touch that sent a shiver through me. I didn't pull away, though every rational part of me screamed that I should. There was something in the way he looked at me, something vulnerable and raw that made it impossible to turn away, and then before I could fully process what was happening, he leaned in, his lips met mine, soft and tentative as if seeking permission. The kiss caught me completely off guard. It It wasn't the kind of kiss I had imagined, a chaste, familial peck on the cheek or forehead. No, this was something else entirely. It lingered, warm and searching, and for a moment I froze, unsure of how to respond. When it ended, the air between us felt charged, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. I turned my gaze toward the fire, my thoughts racing. What did this mean? How have we gotten here? Mike didn't speak, and neither did I. The silence that settled over the room was different from before. Not the comfortable quiet of shared space, but a tension that buzzed just beneath the surface. As the fire burned low and the night stretched on, I felt a strange mix of emotions: confusion, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. All I knew was that nothing between us would ever be the same again. The morning light seeped gently through the curtains, warming the room with a golden glow. I woke to the faint sounds of movement in the kitchen, a clatter of dishes, the hum of a kettle. For a moment I thought it might be my imagination, the remnants of a dream still lingering. But as I sat up, listened more closely, the unmistakable rhythm of someone preparing breakfast reached my ears. It wasn't some I had experienced in years, the feeling of being cared for so deliberately. My routine had been solitary for so long that the idea of someone else taking over even the smallest task felt foreign. A soft knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts before I could respond. The door creaked open, and Mike appeared, balancing a tray in his hands. On it was a carefully arranged plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and a small bowl of fruit, along with a steaming cup of coffee. He set the tray down on the bed and gave me a look that carried both a quiet pride and something softer, something I couldn't quite put into words. His action spoke louder than anything else could have. It wasn't just breakfast, it was a gesture of care, a bridge built over the silence and uncertainty of the past few days. I took a moment to absorb the kindness of it all the way. He had thought of me first thing in the morning. The effort he had put into something so simple yet meaningful, it felt like the beginning of something new, a tentative step forward into a life without the shadows of past grievances. After breakfast, the day unfolded in a way that felt almost surreal in its normalcy. We decided to go to the cinema, an idea that had come up casually during one of our conversations. It had been years since I had gone out for something as ordinary as a movie, and the thought of doing so with Mike felt oddly comforting. The drive to the theater was quiet but not uncomfortably so. The silence was filled with the sound of the car's hum, the soft shuffle of his hands on the steering wheel. I watched the world pass by through the window, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and calm when we arrived. The theater was modest, its vintage marquee announcing the film titles in bold letters. The scent of popcorn filled the air, mingling with the faint murmur of conversation from other patrons. It was a small, intimate space that seemed to fit the mood of the day perfectly inside the dimly lit theater. We chose seats near the back, away from the few other moviegoers scattered throughout the room as the lights dimmed and the previews began to play. I felt a sense of contentment settle over me. It was as though the weight of the past few days and the years before them had momentarily lifted. The movie itself was lighthearted, a romantic comedy that elicited the occasional laugh from both of us. But it wasn't the film that held my attention. It was the way Mike leaned slightly toward me, the way his presence seemed to fill the space between us as the movie progressed. I became acutely aware of the small gestures, the way his arm brushed against mine, the warmth of his hand resting lightly on the armrest between us. Each touch, though subtle, sent a shiver through me, a reminder of the unspoken connection that had grown between us. Toward the end of the film, during a particularly tender scene, he turned toward me. I could feel his gaze on me, and when I glanced over, our eyes met in the flickering light of a screen. Before I could fully process what was happening, he leaned in. His lips met mine, soft and deliberate, and I felt myself melt into the moment. It wasn't hurried or hesitant. It was a kiss that carried the weight of everything we had been through. everything we had left behind, in that quiet, darkened theater, surrounded by the muted sounds of the movie. And the distant hum of life outside the kiss felt like a declaration. It was as though we were starting over, creating a life unburdened by the pain of the past, or the press of people who no longer mattered as we pulled away. I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility. The world outside the theater awaited us, but in that moment it felt like we had created our own little bubble, a space where we could begin anew. The drive home was filled with a quiet contentment, the kind that didn't need words. The house welcomed us back like an old friend, its familiar walls now carrying a sense of renewal. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the day. The breakfast in bed, the shared laughter at the cinema, the kiss that had left me both breathless and grounded. It felt like the start of something beautiful, something neither of us had expected, but both of us were ready to embrace. The days following our outing to the cinema felt like stepping into uncharted territory. There was a new rhythm to our lives, one that seemed to hum quietly beneath the surface, tethering us together in ways I couldn't quite explain. Mike had taken to helping around the house more, almost as if he were trying to establish his presence, to weave himself into the fabric of this home again. I would find him repairing small things that had been neglected over the years, the loose doorknob on the back door, the squeaky hinge on the pantry cabinet. His hands, steady and deliberate, brought a renewed sense of life to the place in the mornings. We often shared coffee at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming in through the windows, casting a golden glow over the room. The conversations between us, though never hurried, grew deeper. He told me more about the struggles he'd faced after the divorce, how his wife had taken everything from him, leaving him not just financially drained, but emotionally hollow. There was a sadness in his voice as he recounted the ways she had chipped away at his confidence, the manipulations and arguments that had left him feeling small. She had taken the house, the car, and even most of his friends, turning them against him with carefully constructed lies. It had been a calculated unraveling of his life, leaving him adrift and unsure of himself. As he spoke, I couldn't help but think of my own past. The years I had spent trying to piece myself together after his father left. It hadn't been as dramatic or vindictive as Mike's divorce, but it had left its scars all the same. The silence, the absence, the feeling of being not enough to make someone stay. They were wounds I still carried even after all this time. In a strange way, our shared misfortunes brought us closer. There was an understanding between us now, a sense that we were no longer just mother and son, but two people who had faced life's cruelties and survived one afternoon. As the clouds gathered outside, signaling an impending storm, we decided to watch an old movie together. The rain began to patter softly against the windows as we settled onto the couch, a blanket draped over our laps. The film was one we had watched countless times when he was younger, a comforting relic of simpler days. But this time it felt different. The closeness between us, the quiet intimacy, made the experience feel almost new. As the movie played, I felt his arm wrap around my shoulders, pulling me gently closer. It was a familiar gesture, one that had once brought comfort during thunderstorms or nights when he couldn't sleep. But now it carried a different weight, a different meaning. I let myself lean into him, resting my head against his chest. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body, it all felt so natural, so right, even as my mind struggled to reconcile the emotions coursing through me. By the time the credits rolled, the rain had intensified, a steady downpour that seemed to cocoon the house in its sound. We stayed there on the couch, the flickering light of a television casting shadows across the room. And then, as if compelled by the moment, he tilted my chin up, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch when his lips met mine. It was soft at first, tentative, as though he were seeking permission. I didn't pull away, instead, I let myself fall into the kiss. The sensation both startling and grounding. It wasn't hurried or desperate. It was an acknowledgement of everything we had been through, of the connection that had grown between us. In the quiet moments we had shared, when we finally broke apart, the world outside felt distant, the storm's roar muted against the warmth of the room. We didn't speak. There were no words that could capture the complexity of what had just happened that night. As I lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in my mind. There was no denying the shift between us now, no pretending that we could go back to what we once were. But instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself, nor for Mike, but it was ours, and for the first time in years, I felt like it was enough. As the days stretched into weeks, I found myself adjusting to a life that I never could have anticipated. The boundaries between us, once clear and defined, had blurred into something that felt both natural and uncharted. It was as if we had built a world of our own within these walls, separate from the expectations and judgments of the world outside. Mike's presence filled the house in a way that was steady and reassuring. He had taken up a quiet rhythm, finding joy in the small routines we shared, cooking meals together, tending to the garden, or simply sitting in the living room with a book while the radio played softly in the background. There was an ease between us now, a comfort that felt deeper than the years we had spent apart. But I couldn't ignore the voice in the back of my mind, the one that whispered of the world beyond our doorstep, said society had its rules, its unspoken guidelines about what was right and what was wrong. And I knew we had stepped beyond those lines. It wasn't something we ever talked about, not directly. There were no words to capture the strange mix of emotions that came with this new closeness, but the quiet glances we exchanged, the touch of his hand against mine when no one else was watching, said everything that words couldn't. I thought often about the path that had brought us here, the years of heartbreak and loneliness that had shaped us both, my own history with his father, the years spent trying to keep our family together while he drifted further away, had left me with an ache I had carried in silence. Mike's story was different, but no less painful. A marriage that had started with hope and ended in betrayal. Perhaps it was that shared pain that had drawn us together, that had allowed us to find solace in one another's presence. It was as if we had become each other's anchor in a world that often felt cold, unyielding, yet the outside world loomed large in my thoughts. What would people say if they knew? What would they think of this life we were quietly building, of the bond that had grown stronger and more complex with each passing day? I couldn't help but wonder if we were being selfish, carving out the small, fragile sanctuary for ourselves, while ignoring the conventions that had governed our lives for so long. But when I looked at Mike, at the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, the way he seemed lighter, freer, I couldn't bring myself to feel regret. We had both spent too long living for others, trying to fit into molds that had never truly suited us. Now, for the first time, it felt like we were living for ourselves. While it wasn't easy, it was real. One evening, as we sat together in the fading light of the day, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. There was no denying that our relationship had shifted, that the lines between mother and son had blurred into something more intimate, more profound. But in that moment, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, I realized that I didn't feel lost or uncertain. The love between us, unconventional as it was, felt steady and secure. It was a love built on years of shared history, of pain and healing, of a connection that had deepened in ways neither of us had expected. The world might never understand, might never accept the choices we had made. But here in this small corner of the world we had created, there was peace. And for now, that was enough.